Okay, let's carry on. What we're going to do now is really get into the code. What we're going to talk about next is the interesting stuff. What about creating web API services using Synergy, and specifically using Synergy.net? Web services are frequently hosted by websites. We've already said you don't have to, you can self-host them if you wish, and we will look at a mechanism for doing that in Synergy later in the afternoon. But for now, we'll carry on using IIS as our web host application. Websites are a combination of things, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and so on, and we don't have support for any of that in Synergy. What we can do is do the code part, which is actually quite useful because web API services are just code. So while we can't do the physical hosting in a web application, we can do everything else, and that's basically what we're going to do. So web API services, we've already seen, are just code. They're classes that inherit from API controller, and we can absolutely do that in Synergy and so on. And why would we want to do that in Synergy? Well, it's probably fairly obvious. We'd like to interact with our back-end systems that we've all got, that we've all developed over a number of years and rely on. So we might want to implement or interact with some Synergy.net code that talks to Synergy ISAM files. We might want to interact with our XF Netlink, XF Server Plus environments. We might want to leverage some existing code and some existing, business logic modules that have been built up over the years and are still useful in this world. And we might want to access, almost certainly want to access Synergy data, be that either locally on the Windows server or whichever server we're hosting this stuff on, or be it on some remote server via XF Server. So lots of reasons why we might want to. The development workflow for implementing Synergy.net web API stuff is actually pretty simple. We just create a Synergy.net class library. We go out to NuGet and say, please give me all the web API stuff, and it downloads it. And all NuGet does, if you're not familiar with it, by the way, is it's just a mechanism for distributing binary code. So when you add a NuGet package, all you're actually doing is downloading some assemblies that some third party has created that give you a certain API or a certain ability to do something. That's all NuGet is. So we add the basic web API scaffolding, if you like, through NuGet, and then we use Synergy to create model classes that describe our data types. We're going to use CLS types, so we're not going to use alphas, decimals, and Synergy integers. We're going to use .NET ints and strings and so on. And if you've got a repository that already describes those record layouts, potentially CodeGen can help you there. Some of my later examples this afternoon, just to save a bit of time, I'll use CodeGen to generate some stuff, and you'll see how that works. And we use Synergy to create our controller classes. Again, ditto, we're going to use CLS types. We can use alphas and decimals within our code, but our external interfaces, the things that the web API sees as operations, we'll make sure that we use only .NET types on those things. We're going to reference the Synergy assembly in our hosting application, and magic happens. I already said web API is really good at just discovering stuff and scaffolding it and hosting it. So we don't have to do anything in particular to configure it. We just create our Synergy assembly, we implement our model classes and our controller classes, and we reference that assembly from the hosting application, and we're up and running. So, not missing you at all, WCF. I don't like your configuration. So, let's get back into some code. Now we're going to start doing some real stuff. So what we're going to do here is, initially, we'll do something really simple. We're going to move the implementation of the sample service from C# into Synergy, just to show you the process of building out a service with Synergy, and then we'll start taking things a little bit further. So let me switch over to here. So what we're going to do is, here's our Visual Studio solution as we left it. As we know, what we've got right now is our single project, which is the web application. And in there, we've got our controllers folder with our values controller that we didn't create. This was created for us by the project template. We added some documentation comments to it, and that's pretty much all. So what we're going to do is build out some Synergy stuff in this environment. So because I know I'm going to need to, I'm just going to copy that code for the values controller, and I'm going to minimize the web server project for the time being, and then I'm going to do a file, add, new project, and into this solution, we're going to go off into our Synergy project templates, and we're just going to pick a class library. I have a project template called Synergy Web API Library. All it is a class library with a pre-existing reference to the appropriate NuGet packages, so it's really not that big of a deal. So I'm going to add a class library to the project. I'm going to call it Web API Services. And there we go. So our new class library, as all of them do, have a really useless class called class. So let's get rid of that. Don't often need a class called class. So we'll get rid of that sample code, and now we've essentially got an empty Synergy.net class library project. First thing we're going to do is we are going to install Web API. So let's go into our Manage NuGet Packages for Solution again, and we should find that the Web API package is there. I don't know whether you are familiar with this dialog, but the way this works is you select under installed, that's what you've got installed, you select the package, and these are the projects in your solution, and the fact that there's a version number there indicates that that package is installed in that project. So if I want to install it in my Web API services, which is my Synergy assembly, then I would check the checkbox and say install, and all it's doing for me is adding references to my project. So if I look under references now, I've got system net HTTP, net HTTP formatting, web HTTP, and so on. And it's also injected the Newtonsoft.json environment into my Synergy project because the Web API tools under the hood use it to do all the serialization and stuff. So now we've got Web API available. There's another update popped up, look. Since we updated earlier, Newtonsoft have released a new version. Anyway, so now we've injected our Web API support into our Synergy environment, and we can start creating stuff. Let's do a build, just to make sure that everything does. We are good. Now what we're going to do is, if you remember, we configured the environment to produce the documentation based on the XML file that's created by the website project. Well, we're going to be doing our Web API stuff in our Synergy project now. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to configure, let me just copy a little thing here. I'm going to go into the project properties of my Synergy project, and I'm going to go to the Build tab, and we're already producing an XML documentation file, but I'm going to paste into there solution.dir, which is a reference to the solution location, web server app data web API services.xml. So I'm going to create an XML documentation file for my Synergy project, but drop it into the web server's app data folder, so it's available over there in that environment. So we'll do that, and then we'll do a build to create that file. And then I'm going to go over to the web server and just adjust that file that we edited previously. So I'm going to go into the help site again, the help page config code, and just tell it about what the XML file is now called. So this is that same thing that we edited earlier, but instead of webserver.xml, it's web API services.xml. So now we should pick up documentation from our Synergy project. Now there are mechanisms, if you Google it, there are some edits you can do in this code to make it pick up any XML file that's in that entire directory. Right now I'm hard coding it to specifically that one for that project, but if you have multiple projects with multiple services defined in them, you can fairly easily amend this code to just have it look for star.xml in the app data folder and load all of them. If you ever need to do that, I've got a piece of code that does that for you. So we should be getting help information from our environment now. Let's do some environmental setup. So we're pretty much done in web server for the time being. In web API services, let's create a new folder called controllers. Just set up some environmental stuff. Let's create new folder models. That will do for the time being. So we've got a controllers and models folder. And now let's create a values controller. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and I'm going to say add new class. And I'm going to create a class called values controller. Okay? Rather than typing the code though, so let's go back into our C# code, into our controllers folder, and again I'm going to say select all and copy, and then I'm going to cheat, go back into my Synergy project and use the Synergy C# to DBL code converter, paste in the C# version, have it produce a Synergy version, copy that and put it into here, and everything should be correct apart from the namespace. So let's keep the namespace. So we just code converted the C# values controller into a Synergy version. So it's basically exactly the same thing. We're just looking at Synergy syntax now. Public class values controller, extends API controller. That's coming from the assemblies that we got from NuGet for Web API. There's our get method that returns a collection of strings. There's our get method that has an ID parameter that returns a single one, and so on. Okay? So in theory, if we build this now, we should be able to run up our web application. So I'm just pressing Control F5 to start without debugging. And when it builds the thing in the background under IIS, there's our service, and this information's now coming from Synergy, and it's not picking up our documentation. We need to tell the web project about the Synergy project. So, references. Add reference. So we need to add a reference in the web project to the Synergy project that contains the Web API controllers. Now when we do a build and look at the site, yes, because I didn't remove it, did I? Let's get rid of values controller out of C#. There we go. So now, you saw me physically delete the values controller out of the C# project. It's not there anymore. And again, when we run up our application, so Web API is now finding values controller over in the Synergy.NET assembly, and therefore it's going out and looking for API documentation for it, finding it in the XML file that we've given it, and presenting the information. And sure enough, if we run /API/values, we get the response from the Synergy.NET code. Just to prove the fact that it is the Synergy.NET code, let's just see if we can do a little debugging. So let's put a breakpoint in there and run the thing in debug mode. And if we go to /API/values, we get a breakpoint in the Synergy code. Okay, so we've now got a Synergy.NET Web API environment.